Hello everyone, today we talk about the foundation of Wallachia as an independent political reality, in spite of the obvious influence that it always received in late medieval history, as we will see now. Essentially, it's the chronology from the surrounding neighbors, but still winning, in fact, such political recognition and identity consolidation in an area that is one of the most difficult in Europe to achieve such a thing, and that, in my opinion, doesn't get enough credit in general. And one of the main problems is, of course, that we're looking at some of the most scarcely documented regions in Europe, and that it's somehow normal even to miss specific formal documentary evidence, right, historical chronology for certain events, but we can reconstruct, in my opinion, fairly easily the dynamic here. So I made a video first of all about black infantry during the 14th century, and I've been talking about Wallachia also recently, for example, in that video about Eastern Balkan warfare exactly during this time. So there is perhaps already a picture. We have to talk about post-foundation Wallachia, of course, and I hope we will do it soon. And the objective, as you understand, is consolidating, right, video after video, the tapestry of this political territorial history of all Europe, and also of this Balkan area that began to look a bit more in depth in since, like, last year, perhaps just slightly earlier than that. And we have seen the complications also in that video about the origins of the Romanian peoples as far as the late antiquity and the migration era in Trans-Danubian Dacia, for example, was concerned, as somehow complicated one that today I'm not going to digress on because it's somehow also useless for today's topic specifically. We will come back on it, right? You know that Vlach, just like Valonians, Valaisians, and so on, is a name that you find indicating Romance regions at the frontier with the Germanic war. But this is one of the at least top or probably the best explanation you can give for this term. That means it would come from Val and meaning strangers, foreigners. So the idea is that since the migration era and later with the Saxon settlement in Transylvania and so on, that what was in fact south of the Carpathians, then in the south, of course, there are other boundaries, but there are no Germanic peoples there. It would be called like the foreigners, right? And in this case, the Vlachs, right? And all. So an ethnonym that was recognized also by other peoples, as we will see now, including the Byzantines. I mean, there is the Vlachoi, Greek for it, etc. So we can identify them with the early Romanians. The main issue being that, in fact, this population seems to have been quite mobile, right, and scattered actually across an important amount of the entire Balkan region, and that eventually coalesced, especially with Wallachia proper, as a definite Romance and eventually Romanian reality. So that's the approximation we give to it. Of course, the thing, as we will see now, is slightly more complex, but it's fair to say also because linguistically you can't really see much of a doubt there. It's a Romance language that survived in the Danubian region that was in fact more Latinized than Hellenized in Roman times, and in fact still in other Balkan languages, even of Slavic stock, you do find a considerable amount of Latin-derived terms, in part also, of course, from the Byzantine side, because especially in the, during the migration era, still great part even of the of Greek language was heavily influenced by Latin, but we're talking here about an older Romanization, right, and a deeper one through Romano-Italic colonies and so on, and that's the reason why you find a Romance language otherwise essentially in a sea of Slavs, just with, as we've seen, Ugro-Finnic and even Germanic, and of course from the other side also Greek communities. Among the oldest attestations of this Vlach country to identify with Wallachia, so in this case on the left side of the Danube, actually, because it actually spaced across both banks right up to the Balkan mountains in the south, as we'll see now. There is a quotation passage from an Armenian book of geography, which is interestingly an interpolation, which means that somebody wrote this, in this case specifically in the incipit, by adding it to the original text, but from essentially the first centuries of the second millennium, so old enough, which refers in fact to an unknown country, at least from an Armenian perspective, called Balak, right, and situated specifically between the Sarmatian and the Zagora countries. The Zagora one would be Bulgaria, so it makes a lot of sense because it's essentially, I mean, the Sarmatians of this, by a in this sense, classical ethnographic approximation, the steppes, like today's southern Ukraine, and in fact, just also down between the in the west, between the Black Sea and the Carpathians. Bulgaria is just from the other side, in fact, and so it does make a lot of sense. This is Wallachia, right? The historical one already attested that early in time. There is another 11th century reference to the Vlach country that is preserved in a 17th century text, but it stems from the Turkic Oguzhname tradition, so the Oguz Khan's tale, literally, and it tells of the story of the battles of the Kumans that we will see now against several peoples, including the Vlachs that in this text are called Ulak. So the Kumans, as you know, were a Turkic tribe that approached the Danube Delta, and we say shortly after 1064-65. We've seen them also in the video about the Byzantine auxiliaries exactly around this time, because they formed an important amount of the lighter cavalry, mostly as horse archers, as you know. There were nomadic, or at best semi-nomadic people. That also from 1068 reached as far east as the Aral Sea, right? And so you have between that and the Danube an important settlement. It's not really a broader domination, because there is no such thing like a strong central power. These are all various tribes that have confederally stuck together, but fundamentally shared this wide pasturage area. So of course we're following the steppe longitudinally, right? And this basically reaches in the west the Danube Valley, and actually there is this other island of the Hungarian steppe that is in fact the westernmost part. But there, at least sedentarization, as you know, had already developed importantly, even among peoples that had come from the steppe, even if not maybe originally in the case of the Magyars, that were more like forest people, but they had been injected eventually in the steppe, and they were fundamentally the same thing in terms of lifestyle question, culture, and so on. The different Kuman groups were under independent rulers, thus, or khans, that were, because of this political fragmentation, actually heavily meddled in the political life of the surrounding areas, and more powerful sanitary realities, such as the Kievan Rus, the Byzantine Empire, right? But inhabiting the steppes, and this was always the problem, like you couldn't quite go there, like with a military expedition, and simply, occupy these areas. You could crush them, you could inflict heavy losses, and so on. But these peoples were just able to move and withdraw and settle somewhere else, right? And therefore not giving you that satisfaction of stopping their raids forever or whatever. So they were actually a pain in the behind, but they lived essentially like that for sake of survival, because they literally didn't know better. And in this, they of course also relied heavily on other populations that they managed, sedentary ones, that they managed to somehow in part subdue, in part just of course also co-opting, but also side with. Of course, when we look at this steppes area, especially from European side, you realize that these are not just the wilderness. Like, there are actually sedentary peoples already inhabiting that. And Wallachia, that is not technically steppes, but it basically at the end of this corridor between the Carpathians and the Black Sea, from which all these steppes peoples had always come from, were kind of more habituated to this kind of reality. They were sedentaries, they were mountaineers, as a matter of fact. They practiced transhumance, which is also very part of the reason why they were, in that sense, themselves kind of semi-nomadic by some degree, and they moved a lot over the centuries. And who participated, together with the Cumans, in essentially the raids, especially against the Byzantine Empire, right? And these were the Vlachs specifically, the ones who could provide with this support, the ones living in the Balkan Mountains, because they would show the Cumans which were the mountain passes that these foreigners didn't know per se, and the Vlachs instead knew the terrain very well. So we're looking, in this case, at the right bank of the Danube, essentially today's Bulgaria. And together with them, they participated in the raids, because that's also what the Vlachs basically did on a regular basis, whenever they could. Because, again, also these were populations that didn't control the lowlands, that were mostly under the direct domination of somebody else. And every once in a while, they would come cattle raiding, etc. And as you know, the Balkan frontier was one of the single most brutal realities in the history of mankind. So these peoples were particularly tough and resilient, because just, again, living exactly within the corridor where all steppe peoples from millennia have come, have transformed you in that. Needless to say, this wasn't a particularly advanced or developed area, because those same movements had somehow flattened it. But over time, Europe, also in these frontier areas, was consolidating, was essentially developing ever more solid political and social structures. And so the Vlachs came to be ever more important in this context. For example, and I explained this in multiple videos, but also in specifically one about the rise of the Second Bulgarian Empire, in fact, the Balkan Vlachs specifically rose up in arms against the Byzantine Empire together with the Bulgarians, right? So creating a sort of what was known in the sources at the time, Vlach Cuman Bulgarian Empire at this point. So not just like the very hardcore Bulgarian. It was still, however, a melange of different elements, including Slavs, as you know, most, like in the first Bulgarian one. But that had been conquered by the Byzantines, in fact, privatizing somehow, also leveling the accomplishments of what had been, in fact, the early and high medieval empire local in Bulgaria, that now needed more people to join in, right, and carrying out essentially raids in this decadent Byzantine Empire by the end of the 12th century, just before, in fact, the Saint Crusaders conquered it, as it was torn apart by dynastic struggle. As you know, that's how they actually called the Fourth Crusade, at the gates of Constantinople themselves. And so this was the habit we've seen many times, that from the Balkan mountains, that were, again, very different from the Byzantine, essentially coastal Aegean reality. These populations, so mountaineers mixed with nomads, etc., would come to raid along the valleys that lead to the Aegean Sea, and gradually, expanding. These Balkan powers were rising once again at the contraction of the Byzantine one. In the Western sources, you find properly the recognition of the Vlachs being a major player in this enterprise, because the state was known as Bulgaria and Wallachia. For example, in 1204, the same Pope elevated the head of the Bulgarian church to the rank of primas, that is, primate, of, quote, all Bulgaria and Wallachia. Right, so the Westerners also knew perfectly well that the Vlachs were around, were a major element here. And naturally, this does reflect just the way this polity was presenting itself like, because it was obviously a coalition of different peoples. And Wallachia, as this exonym for northern Bulgaria, would disappear from the sources only after the mid-13th century, right, when Bulgaria somehow reinforces herself in the process and was the stronger actor here, as opposed to the Vlachs and the Cumans as well. The major power neighboring these areas, however, was Hungary. That had always, as you know, tended to secure the Danubian frontier as a wall, right? This frontier was very deep with the Byzantine Empire. It stretched over hundreds of kilometers, and it was, as we were saying before, primitively brutal. It was, the terrain was utter nightmare. You really don't know between the Iberian Peninsula, the Italian one, and the Balkan one, which is the worst for fighting a war. And the efforts to centralize, as you know, were by medieval times great, but exactly because very often were insufficient. And thus, this, especially the destabilization of the Byzantine Empire, but as we will see now, also other issues happening with the Mongol invasion and also internal strife within the Kingdom of Hungary, would favor the rise of the Vlachs as more independent people. In 1211, King Andrew II of Hungary, who ruled between 1205 and 1235, famously settled the Teutonic Knights from the Holy Land in the region of Brasov in Transylvania. This was the first, Teutonic foreign deployment in Europe, starting from their German base, right? This is interesting because, eventually they would go in Prussia, but this was their first post abroad. And the main objective of Andrew of Hungary was to stop the frequent incursions of the Cumans into Transylvania by essentially colonizing it by this Teutonic presence. It's obvious, as we've seen also in the video about medieval Transylvania, that we have, however, not stretched chronologically as far as that. Is just like the early and part of the High Middle Ages. There were local princes, right, that were, again, not particularly powerful, but had entrenched very well in this eastern frontier of the based Hungarian kingdom, if not empire, in perspective. And that had rendered difficult the entire enterprise. Of course, here there was something similar to what was happening in Wallachia, because the Transylvanians were a bit more established. There was also an important degree of German colonization, not just through the Teutonic Knights, but because actually there were already Saxons being located in those regions, especially the military ones. We've seen how the Ostsiedlung was used by these Central European monarchs to actually centralize further. We were talking about it just for Poland the other day in the 14th century. And this initial settlement was actually a success because the Teutonic Knights were quite efficient and managed to stem the Cumans and even settling further across the frontier, even consolidating an important amount of power that rendered Andrew of Hungary rather suspicious about their intention, right? According to a royal charter of 1222, the Knights' military power stretched across the Carpathians all the way to the Danube, right? And this meant that the Knights were essentially holding now this in fief, because the King of Hungary had fundamentally granted them also essentially whatever they could hold from that feudal delegation, right? The Teutonic Knights won several victories. Ultramontes Nivium, right, is quite eloquently witnessed also by papal letters that confirm that this German order had fundamentally entered Wallachia, right, south and east of the Carpathians by themselves, right. At this point in 1225, Andrew II essentially forced the Teutonic Knights out of the Carpathians because he essentially accused them of having practically ignored his authority. And that's objectively what they were doing, because again, everybody on that frontier had ignored the Hungarian authority. So of course the Teutonic Knights were kind of more westernly manageable also in international relations, but of course they were also a mean of other rulers further west to just also by proxy carrying out their own plans, etc. But in many ways it was just a local Teutonic need of aggrandizement, let's put it in this way, that would conquer them so many places, and even building new castles in the process, and so on. These years are tough for everyone involved because the Mongols entered Europe in 1223. This time they stopped in Eastern Europe, defeating the joint Rus-Cuman army at the Battle of the River Kalka in today's Ukraine. Some of the areas occupied by the Russians currently. And this was, in fact, essentially the southeastern frontier of the Kievan Rus. And as you know, the Mongols crushed this principality, or at least they were able to bring the entire Rus de facto under a condition of vassalage, right? And in the process, the Rus had received also the Cuman support, because the Rus and the Cumans had always been clashing with one another, but of course the Rus were more powerful, as we've seen, and many Cumans also abysmally served them and in their armies. Now, however, the Mongols not just had managed to subdue Russia, but was interested in going further west, as they would. They were roaming Armenia too during that time, etc. But the major routes of invasion for Central Europe fundamentally were through the Rus in Poland and through this steppes corridor, essentially entering the Danube Valley. I made multiple videos about the Mongol invasions, but we will have to come back on them in details as well. These areas of Europe were, yes, more habituated to frontier warfare with the nomads, but aside from the fact that the Mongols were just at another level of military development, they had already received an important Chinese input and so on. They were also somehow more coalescent polities, right? They were not so solid like, say, what was happening essentially in Frankish Europe broadly meant. That's the same reason, say, why Andrew II had called the Teutonic Knights, and Constantinople had fallen to the French and the Venetians. So it's an interesting phase because the West is basically booming, and that's when, as we've seen, the meeting with the Mongols is somehow also more interesting to analyze, if you want. In any case, Wallachia, as you understand, was basically along the way of the Mongols for the further invasion, and had already probably witnessed much of the consequences of the river Kalka indirectly through some Cuman groups that had literally been shattered by the invasion, and that decided to essentially Christianize, to westernize, because they realized they couldn't go on living as they had always done before as nomads, and now the Mongol pressure brought them to choose side, and of course they chose the West themselves. As early as 1227, one of the Cuman chieftains, known in the sources as Boricius or Bosch, subjected himself and his people in the process to the future king of Hungary, Bela IV. So there was essentially a formal ritual conversion to Christianity, and also the agreement of the payment of an annual tax plus the tithe that, of course, the ecclesiastical administration required. Why is this event important? Because it basically happened in part within the same Wallachia, and it brought to the establishment of an ecclesiastical province that was the Roman Catholic Diocese of Cumania, which was located, in fact, in northeastern Wallachia and southwestern Moldavia. I made a video about Moldavia that can be useful as far as the Vlachs are concerned too. I forgot to mention before. This happened in 1228. And consider also the broader picture. As we were saying before, the Roman Catholics had conquered Constantinople. This was a major event because, of course, the patriarchate of the imperial city had become Catholic, Roman Catholic now, and the entire Balkans were now under the pressure, at least, of a significant Western Roman Catholic presence, right? The popes had always been interested in the Balkans for many reasons, and historically the region was brought under essentially the Byzantine sphere of influence, also as far as the spiritual practice was concerned. But Hungary was also Roman Catholic, and was in part also benefiting, as you understand, from the disgregation of the Byzantine Empire that had been a significant rival over the centuries. And this, say, Western management of areas that reach as far as Eastern Europe is, frankly, quite interesting. We've seen even the Principality of Volhynia coming closer to the Roman papacy in this process, etc., because the Mongols had basically highlighted that there was no other that could save Europe but the broader West. And political as much as religious cohesion was particularly important. What happened is that there was a significant presence of Vlachs within the newly established bishopric of Cumania, which was called like this again because the Cumans were the most noticeable ethnicity, at least starting from those geographical areas, but mostly to the far east further. So the Vlachs, even though counted in the broader system, were not just, this was not the diocese of Wallachia per se, right? And there is an interesting assessment in the that we can draw from the epistolary correspondence between the Hungarian crown prince and Pope Gregory IX, who was pontiff between 1227 and 1241, about the presence of Orthodox prelates active among the local Vlachs. So, of course, the Orthodox presence was essentially budding a sort of resistance from powers that eventually felt they could even contrast in a way or another these Western ones locally, because they hadn't been so scared by the Mongols yet and were actually emerging at this point, and so they could still use that ecclesiastical policy to their own advantage, without considering, of course, that yes, the Byzantine presence was stronger in the Balkans. Bulgaria was Orthodox and so on, so that was their normal way of Christianity, aside from the, and of course, the relative unrefinement compared to the Byzantine standards as far as the ecclesiastical matters were concerned. But still, consider the Cumans were pagan, essentially. The Diocese of Cumania was also de jure part of the Kingdom of Hungary, so this was just from the Arpad side, like stepping into Wallachia and exploiting the political instability of the entire region to say, okay, well, we will take care of it. This is why King Andrew II adopted the title of King of Cumania in 1233. Also, this may have been a way to say, okay, we deny the local Vlachs an identity because these are the major problem. Like, as we will see now, the Hungarians tried to control this area, so they wouldn't make the favor to the locals of calling them with their actual names. They would say, this is just Cumans, right? Even though Wallachia didn't have much to do with them at the core as a sedentary people. There can be no doubt that the Hungarians, during the establishment of this diocese, occupied it with military garrisons, especially guarding the southern slopes of the Carpathian Mountains in northeastern Wallachia, because that's what Hungary was also concretely interested in. Again, we've seen it with the Teutonic Knights. Essentially, they were coming in the same places and occupying them, but by themselves. The military outposts on this frontier are, however, documented explicitly only during the Mongol invasion of 1241 by Roger of Torre Maggiore. In parallel with the emergence of the Second Bulgarian Empire, that was more kind of Byzantinely oriented and directed, the Kingdom of Hungary pursued an expansionistic policy in the Balkan Peninsula, not just in Wallachia. From the end of the 12th century, even, when the Byzantine Empire was already giving signs of cracking. So much so that, to that end, the region of Oltenia, that fundamentally situated between the Danube, the Southern Carpathians, and the Olt River, was put under the control of a Hungarian governor, who received the traditional title of Ban, that by that point had become essentially a feudal one in the Kingdom of Hungary. The center of this new province that would become the Banate of Severin was in fact the fort of Severin. This today's Drobeta Turnu Severin in Romania, on the Danube, in the proximity of the Iron Gates that, as you know, are a major gorge on the river Danube, well, in fact fortified naturally by the mountains. The first Hungarian band mentioned historically in the province is Luke in 1233. The Mongol invasion produced quite interesting changes here. So Batu Khan sets force to the west with a major force in 1236. It's an extraordinary feat of military and logistical capacity, and we have widely discussed it. And the sources tell us that, of course, the Cumans were what was left of them further west, were essentially devastated by this wave in 37-38, right? We don't know in detail about any military event, but the fact that the Cumans basically fled en masse from the so-called Desht-i Kupchak in the sources, the steppe of the Cumans, right, to Hungary, to Bulgaria, and other neighboring territories, is quite eloquent about the crushing defeat that they had suffered at the hand of the Mongols. Some of these Cuman groups naturally survived in an identitary fashion, so much so that it would become important in the same Hungary, where they even married into the royalty and became a sort of private royal army against the native oligarchs that were threatening always, of course, the prerogatives of the monarch. However, they were heavily debilitated. Most of their aristocracy had probably fallen in battle or just as a consequence of their political failure. And of course, it was easier to integrate this elements somewhere else. These steppes of Eastern Europe were at this point occupied by Batu Khan's army, and they would become part of the Golden Horde at the disgregation of the Mongol Empire. The area, however, that stretches, so the area of Wallachia, roughly, in the lower Danube region, was not directly occupied, right? You can't talk about an important political influence as a sort of client reality. It was a matter of how far could the Khan's authority stretch, right? And of course, not even the steppe was permanently occupied, because again, most of the Golden Horde capacity would eventually rest, as most powers of this time, on the deterrence, represented by how far and frequently you can bring your armies where, right? Thus, Wallachia, in spite of the Mongol crossing basically all over eastern, not all of Central, but important parts of Central and Europe and the Balkans, remained out of the Mongol Empire. And in the case of these local powers, especially in such a fragmented area like the Balkans, began to emerge more autonomously, also because Hungary received a pretty important blow, right? It didn't actually stop growing, but during the 14th century would be a general crisis, right, of all the big powers, as you know, and Europe. And so these smaller ones somehow consolidated locally more strongly. And it's within this context that we look at the rise of Wallachia. we know that a lot of Cumans left properly the same Wallachian plain. As we've seen, they already inhabited it, right? After the Mongol invasions, they felt too exposed. They didn't want to be there, and they moved, right? While the Vlachs, so the Romanian population, remained there because they were sedentaries, and they would just, remain such, trying to reinforce actually locally. And they were ruled by leaders known as either knezzes or voivodes. The knez is in this context like a sort of king, right? And the voivode, kind of a military commander, but the titles could be somehow overlapping, and of course there wasn't a particularly developed hierarchy or centralizing capacity by any of these lords, fundamentally. In 1247, so after the Mongol tide had come back where it came from, King Bela IV was somehow reconstructing his country after the deluge, trying to bring new monastic military orders in the Carpathian frontier and beyond, in Wallachia, that now, as we've seen, the Hungarians considered more like their own. This time he resorted to the Knights Hospitallers that, however, failed to accomplish this colonization, as they practically didn't even occupy the posts that had been called to, specifically in the land of Severin. Land of Severin, that was Wallachia, as we've seen, had been created as such, essentially as an Hungarian Banate. The Royal Charter for the Knights, dated on June 2nd, 1247, lists, however, 4 autonomous provinces, the Khanate, in Oltenia and Western Montania, the latter between the Danube, south and east, the Carpathian Mountains, the Transylvanian Alps branch, and Moldavia, both north, and the Olt River to the west. The latter being the border between Montania, that is greater, and Oltenia, lesser Wallachia. This is interesting, of course, for our understanding of what Wallachia was at the time. Now, what does this charter say specifically? That 2 of these provinces, the Khanate of Ioannis and Farkas, were actually given to the Knights Hospitallers, but the Khanate of Litovoi and Seneslau were exempted from such grant, and the royal charter expressly states that they were to be left, quote, to the Vlachs as they had owned it until now, right? It's also from this charter that we get that the voivode of Litovoi had extended on the northern side of the Transylvanian Alps into the region of the Hunedoara, right? And the King of Hungary was not happy of this, so much that he removed such portion from Litovoi's authority in the same 1247. From there on, in fact, at least according to the Hungarians, the Litovoi's Khanate was to be restricted to the Oltenian part of the Jiu River. This tells us lots of interesting things that become more interesting when we will see now how the legends about the formation of Wallachia politically in a kind of unitary sense are concerned, because the Vlachs inhabited also parts of Transylvania, so we don't know whether the Vlachs here had simply where the chieftains at least had come from in this process. If they came from further south, if they were instead Transylvanians, right, and more to that. But it does seem actually that it was the Vlachs south of the Carpathians that had the power to infiltrate Transylvania. And that's why the Hungarian king was also kind of freaking out about it, at least, modestly to this. The Hungarian kings had much bigger reasons to freak out, including just the one that had just passed, the Mongol one. But it was important for the political and territorial integrity of this frontier, these locals not to take over, which was what was actually starting to happen. The voivode Stanislaw instead held the territories of central and southern Montania on the banks of the rivers Argeș and Dambrovița. The Hospitallers, as we've seen, do not do much, right? I don't know whether, because properly they wouldn't want to go on that frontier that was objectively pretty messed up, and or there was any other problem, including maybe the resistance of the Vlachs, but it would be basically the same thing. And after this charter, basically we don't know much of what happens for decades in the region. It's evident, however, that Litovoi voivodeship was the most enterprising of all these black powers, and that it would lead eventually towards the unification of Wallachia. Either this Litovoi, or Litovoi is a name, right, of a person, so they were calling these provinces with names of those who ruled over them, so that they weren't defined kind of in another way. And this is also realistic, because we don't know other previous districts that, because there was practically no overlordship that could see. Hungary was, a structured kingdom with a feudal hierarchy and territorial administration and so on. These Vlachs had emerged from essentially local clans, and they were also quite semi-nomadic minded, as we've seen as well. And we don't know also to which degree, of course, they had adopted sometimes the same, maybe Kuman lifestyle, because that also happened. I mean, as far as at least not properly the hardcore nomadic one, but especially starting from the 13th, 14th century, this idea of, again, of a leader that could move with his retinue and coming to lord over other clans and so on. So that's quite a, we know that also, say, the Rus, for example, adopted importantly the Mongol, political culture type, because it was much more authoritarian, right? So among these peoples, and also the fact that the area had been called Cumania by the same Hungarians, may have somehow received an important input from the steppe political culture to assert their own personal prerogatives. So this little boy, or perhaps his namesake son, was at war with the Hungarians and killed in battle sometime during the 70s of the 13th century. We think at least it may have been the son of the aforementioned one in the 40s, because people didn't live and rule so long normally, but maybe it's still the same person. And in the same battle which this little boy was killed, his brother Barbad was captured. He was brought to Hungary, where he had to ransom himself, but also recognize Hungarian rule over his lands, namely formally. Again, the Hungarian capacity to directly rule there was quite limited, but it was important also on the base of the oaths that were sworn, the documents were signed to at least set the precedents for enforcing royal authority in Wallachia. Now, there is this climatic event recorded by the chronikistic legend, folklore, tradition, if you want. That is this so-called dismounting of the mountains of the Carpathians specifically by the so-called Radu Negru, that is to say, Radu the Black, or Negru Voda, that is the Black Voivode, which would be, in fact, the first voivode of Wallachia in her entirety. That's why it's so important. There is essentially just a chronicling tradition dating to the modern age, the 17th century specifically, narrating that a herceg or duke of Fagarash and Almash, named in fact Radu Negru, became the first ruler of the land. It's interesting to see herceg in Romanian, which of course corresponds to Herzog in German, the name for duke. That tells you the degree of Transylvanian Saxon influence that this Romanian lands received. Now, what about this Radu Negru? Right, we will see now better what the texts say, but in essence, the story goes that he was a leader who came with some colonists that are mentioned as properly as Romanians, Catholics, and Saxons from Fagarash in Transylvania. The first documentary evidence for a terra blacorum on the territory later called Fagarash comes from Hungary in the early 13th century, where a property register mentions that the King Andrew II of Hungary had fundamentally transferred some lands previously belonged to the Vlachs to the Cistercian abbey at Karza. This land is called properly Terra Blacorum, right? So stressing the fact that at least it had been Vlach, right? So making Fagarash, yes, again a Black territory in Transylvania. So what this Radu Negru does is crossing the Carpathian Mountains to Wallachia and specifically Muntenia, and founding essentially the capitals of the country in Campulung and Curtea d'Erceș. These chronicles date with an important degree of precision, the Anno Mundi specifically, to the year 1290 or 1292, which actually, as we will see now, follow a Byzantine tradition of the 14th century that actually confirms this. So that would be the end of the 13th century, the moment when such Wallachian principality would be established according to the same Wallachian tradition of later times. The text refer to the term founding properly as Desht-i, which is the aforementioned dismounting, which refers to, in fact, the crossing, dismounting from the mountains, right? Literally dismounting, not in the etymologically in Romanian, but still, right? Literally crossing over. Descalicat, as you understand, also from the Latin root, means to descalate, to descend, right? To come down from somewhere. Now, this aspect, this verb, even properly, is quite, and the Transylvanian origin is quite an object of debate for the local national historiography, because it's important, like in a Romanian historical perspective, whether the founder, the alleged founder of Wallachia, would be a Transylvanian or a Wallachian specifically. And most historians, and as we've seen from some hint also before, essentially think that it would be more likely for this ruler to have been just a local Vlach. I mean, from the region of Wallachia, not the Vlachs of Transylvania. Now, this aspect may not be so important after all, because the Vlachs were really similar, even across the Carpathians, right? And there may have been some, again, leader that was called because, say, he was, for example, more into Hungarian politics, was more, say, military skilled, and say, let's call that guy. It is also an external one. We've seen it many times historically. You call an external ruler because he doesn't personally have the power to enforce anything per se, but you are actually the one who is providing him with power to rule locally according to the to your traditional customs. And in general, when you look at these chronicles, we'll see now more in detail, you realize that yes, there is a specific tradition from which it draws from, but it's not really like the evidence of, say, hardcore, like, documentation dating to, in fact, the late 13th to beginning of the 14th century Wallachia, right? It's mostly depending on very often external chronicles external to the country mean, and then eventually being said, okay, it's how it happened, and then it becomes a story, and you start adding the interesting details that somehow are, as we will see now, also adherent to the previous historiographical in fact, evidence this tradition was coming from, but it's not to be understood as we literally know what happened because we know the story, right? And also, the thing for how it went was probably much more interesting, complex, and just if we knew what happened, we would tell it in detail, but we really don't. In any case, it's perhaps not this enormous deal. The origin of Oltenia is given by some of these chronicles differently. For them in general, the land was colonized by the Romanians from Turnu-Severin, so with a sort of east push from the Hungarian-dominated lands, which is similar to what happened to Moldavia. So much so that even the crossing of the Carpathians actually seems to have been reinforced, at least in the bias, to stress, look, how the Moldavians crossed the Carpathians. They have their own historiographical tradition about that. Let's say that fundamentally this happened also in the case of Wallachia, right? It's not even entirely it, right? It may be, again, real, correct. There wouldn't be anything strange historically, right? Just we can't demonstrate it. And the same tradition states that such colonists from Severin, that were Romanians though, according to the story, founded two other capitals, as we've seen before, Radu Negru did, that are Strehaia and Craiova, right? So also relevant centers. So after the arrival of Radu Negru and his de-escalation, these Romanians eventually swore allegiance to him, right? So unifying Greater and Lesser Wallachia. Radu Negru's characters is shrouded in mystery, right? We do not have practically any detail about him provided by any other source, evidence of sort. Right, some chronicles attribute to him the foundation of various holy places, such as the monastery at Curtea der Desht, but they confuse him with the later voivodes of Wallachia, such as Radu I from the 70s, the 80s of the 14th century, Neagoe Basarab, that was from the early 16th even. So this was the idea that Radu Negru founded everything, right? And the older the better, but it's not quite the same thing. In any case, it's not even particularly important. It's a big deal that Wallachia came to be what it was at that point, and the other indicators we have are frankly more interesting. There is a debate regarding also why was Radu Negru called like that, and so I will not enter now in the historiographical issue. but somebody said he was called black because he was actually a Cuman, and so for the Wallachians he was darker than the average. But there is no evidence for this, and it may have even been the case that he had Cuman origins, but again, there is no evidence for this, so it's just a story and pseudo history per se. So all these legends may echo as well the general establishment of the Transcarpathian frontier marked by the Kingdom of Hungary, right, with its capital at Kampulung, that was probably carried out during the last decade of the 13th century. So it was a way of saying, look, we did it, but it actually was the Hungarians, at least in a broader sense of political administrative coalescence. Doesn't mean so much even here, because the Vlachs still were the local rulers. There is a tombstone dating to 1300 dedicated to what is written, in fact, Comes Laurentius de Longo Campo. The title Comes, so Count Lawrence of Campulung, because that's the actual name in Latin, from the Latin equivalent, may speak again of a comical figure of sort in this locality. However, someone said that there may have been already a Saxon leader community in Campulung that had a Comes on its own. These are debates that I'm not descending, because again, the whole picture is more important. Just, I would read for you the two chronicles that tell the story of Radu Negru. The first one is from the 17th century, the Chronica Balenilor by Radu Popescu, that says, in 6798, those 90s of the 13th century, there was a voivode called Voivode Radu the Black, who had his seat in Fagarash from the fathers and forefathers of the Romanians who had come from Rome in the days of Emperor Trajan, decided to move his seat on the other side of the Carpathians. This is the thing, and we have, this was from the 1600s. Then in the 18th, we have the Cantacuzino Chronicle, not the John VI Cantacuzenus. That's another thing. This is an 18th century Wallachian chronicler and nobleman, I think, himself, because these were the literates to that board this memories tradition and story that goes in a more elaborate kind of way. It says, history of Wallachia from the time when the Orthodox Christians dismounted there, interestingly enough, but earlier the Romanians arrived, who had separated from the Romans and wandered to the north. Having crossed the waters of the Danube, they dismounted at Turnu Severin. Others in Hungary, by the waters of the Olt, by the waters of the Mureș, and by the waters of the Tisza, reaching as far as Maramureș. So these are Transylvanians, right? Those who had dismounted at Turnu Severin spread all along the foot of the mountains towards the waters of the Olt. Others went downward all along the Danube. Having this way all the places been filled with them, they arrived at the outskirts of Nicopolis, that is today's Bulgaria, and Nicopol on the Danube. Then the boyars, who are of noble families, gathered in order to have their own leaders. These great bands, a family named Basarab, was appointed to the bandship. The first seat was decided to be at Turnu Severin, the second seat to be set up farther at Streaia, and the third seat to be set up even farther at Craiova. And it happened like that. Much time went by, and they were governing in that region. In 6798 Anno Mundi, there was a voivode in Hungary called Voivode Radu the Black, Great Duke of Almash and Fagarash. He set out from there together with his whole household, and with many other people, Romanians, Papists. Consider this is a post-Reformation uh, you know, time, of course, the 18th century, Saxons, and all kind of men. It's as if here they were perhaps distinguishing the Romanians and even the Saxon immigrants from maybe the Hungarians that represented the Catholic authority, generally speaking, as the royal one. And they cared about stressing the fact that it was the Hungarians in a world that was Orthodox, however disappointed already at the time largely. They descended towards the waters of the Dąbrowica, starting this way to establish a new country. First, they founded the town called Campolung, where a large, beautiful, and lofty church was built. Afterwards, they settled at Argeș, where another large town was founded. By building stone castles, princely houses, and a large and beautiful church, the prince's seat was also established there. Some of the people who had come down together with him went farther along the foothills as far as the waters of the Siret and towards Braila. Others went downward, establishing towns and villages, and they reached all the places as far as the banks of the Danube and all along the Alt. Right? So this is particularly interesting because it shows how the same chronicles could somehow, elaborate on this event. Then we have another figure, that is Basarab I, known as properly the founder. Right? We don't know whose son he was. Right? It is not specified historically, and there is no direct rule even of when Basarab took the office of voivode of Wallachia. However, the Emperor John VI Cantacuzene, that was also a chronicler, in his history narrates that in 1423 Basarab armies joined in the fighting between Bulgaria and Constantinople, that, as you know, had been reconquered by the Palaiologoi, and supported, in this case, the Tsar Michael Shishman of Bulgaria, who ruled between 1323 and 1330. In fact, against the Byzantines in this regard. We have a diploma dated to July the 26th, 1324, in which the same King of Hungary, Charles I, refers to Basarab as Voivodam Nostrum Transalpinum, which literally means this guy is our Transcarpathian voivode, indicating, of course, that Basarab was formally a vassal of the King of Hungary, right? And to be recorded in a diploma, of course, even using the adjective nostrum stresses that he really belonged, right, to that. It was not just like it's our because we think as Hungarians that Wallachia belongs to us, right? It was properly a legitimate position in his office of voivode. However, things wouldn't last with the Hungarians, because Basarab fundamentally stopped accepting the suzerainty of the Hungarian crown, right? And that's where things began to change, right? So basically, see a black reality that had already, consolidated by some degree, a bit by just local strengthening, a bit by Hungarian, let's say, management. And there is, of course, an inherent attrition for which Basarab feels confident enough in his power base to stop recognizing the King of Hungary as his own feudal overlord, right? And the reason being likely that the Hungarians didn't want at all these Vlachs actually taking part in the Byzantine-Bulgarian struggle, because it went against their international policy, and thus could not accept this, and even as proxies, right? Because the Vlachs were doing this autonomously. I don't think there was any Hungarian backing, especially at this point at least. In fact, in a new diploma, that is actually just the year after the aforementioned one, dated in fact to June the 18th, 1325, Saint King Charles I of Hungary mentions the voivode Bazarab Transalpinum rege corone infidele. Right, so this is beautiful because it contrasts magnificently with what's said before. Our voivode of the Transcarpathia. Instead here it's Bazarab, the Transcarpathian, so a random guy, unfaithful to the royal crown, and of course not even recognized as a voivode anymore, which was a title that was just even black in nature, right? So the Hungarians just had confirmed it as a title, even though it was part of another tradition. And that's where things started going interesting, and how Wallachia earned fundamentally and formally its independence, if you want, because King Charles I of Hungary, that, as you know, was an important ruler from the Neapolitan Angevin branch, had somehow modernized Hungary importantly, mounted up a military expedition against Bazarab in 1330. So in other words, he invaded Wallachia, trying to restore in the southeastern frontier of the kingdom, in fact, royal authority, which is fascinating because, of course, there were different expeditions in the eastern frontiers, but they were always out of, say, maybe not exasperation, but what you could earn from there was more kind of moral than material, right? To show that if you wanted, you could even come as far as the frontier with an entire army. And the king marched to Severin and took it from Bazarab. This already shows how this voivode was ruling from essentially the most, at least, advanced area of the country, from the Hungarian one initially. So it was already the premise for him being fundamentally a unitary ruler of most of Wallachia. At this point, Hungarian military might was impressive, so Bazarab asks for a truce, offers to refund 7,000 silver marks for the cost of the royal expedition. He is even willing to send his son as a hostage at the royal court in Hungary. It was basically the normal practice, right? Even the Ottomans would require these things to their vassals later on. But Charles refuses this because he's confident that he can crush the rebel and get it over with it. He advances properly further into Wallachia and lays the land waste, right? That's how you do it. You basically start burning, exterminating, raping, also enslaving, because frankly, the Balkans were that too, right, compared to Western Europe by a degree. But the Vlachs, that, as we've seen, were pretty tough people, resist, and Charles must retreat through the Carpathians back to Hungary to save the royal army. Right, the Vlachs, as you understand, were specialized in guerrilla ambushes and so on. And what they actually do, in fact, is that in a long and narrow valley, they ambush the Hungarian army and fight a battle for 3 days, from November the 9th to the 12th, 1330, right, considering it also makes night relatively early. The Hungarian army is essentially trying to cross, but the heights are occupied by the Romanians that keep throwing the hell on them from the top. This is the so-called Battle of Posada, that is also beautifully represented in the Chronicum Pictum of Hungary, and it was a major defeat for the Hungarians. The king was able to escape with his life by exchanging his royal coat of arms with one of his retainers. So it's a disaster and a turning point in the Hungarian-Wallachian relations, for which we speak of the foundation of the latter's polity, right? In fact, after this defeat, during the course of the 14th century, the status of Wallachia was still regulated essentially within the Hungarian domination, but still by an autonomous degree that showed us the voivodes recognized already with an important prestige on their own, right? Basarab had naturally won an important international prestige from his victory at Posada, and just a few months after this success, in February 1331, Basarab contributed also to the establishment of his son-in-law, that was Ivan Alexander, on the throne of the Tsars of Bulgaria in Tarnovo. We have seen also is the sea of many important buildings, also with interesting iconographic evidence for the equipment of this broader Eastern Balkan area at the time. This put the Wallachian ruler on an important step above compared to the previous status, and as a way of essentially affirming the Wallachian independence from the Kingdom of Hungary, Basarab's son, which is Nikolai Alexandru, sought Byzantine approval for the creation of an Orthodox see for his land. This, as you understand, brings the Wallachians back to Orthodoxy, even though they had always been that by the wide majority. But that was very political, because essentially it said we don't want to be Catholic as the Hungarians, right? So we will simply establish an ecclesiastical hierarchy on the base of the relation with Constantinople. In fact, the Palaiologoi sent Nikolai, the metropolitan of Vicina, Iakintos, that was already a protege of Nikolai, had been living at the Wallachian court for a while, who became, quote, the legitimate pastor of all, and this is the Greek term, Ungro-Wallachia, right, and for the blessing and the spiritual direction of himself, his children, and all his lordship. And after the death of Iakintos, the metropolitic title will be changed to actually all Ungro-Wallachia, which is a bit like saying the Tsar of all Rus, right? The idea that Vlach lands were still somehow coalescing in a unitary direction. Of course, they were largely governed by in a decentralized fashion, but it was like saying, let's elevate this ruler, and also he through the power of his church to a higher level all over this country, right? And naturally, the name Ungro-Wallachia is in the Byzantine sources is quite eloquent, because more than saying this is the Wallachia that borders Hungary, which basically was true for the entirety of Wallachia, it rather seemed to stress that that was the part of Wallachia that had properly been part of the Hungarian royal administration, which was not true, at least by the same degree, at least for what we've seen for the Banate of Severin, for, say, the Moldavians, right? So, of course, the Hungarians would always claim an overlordship of these areas, but the thing was complicated, to say the least. Now, the sources speak, as we were saying before, of Greater Wallachia, Wallachia Major, or simply Wallachia for Muntenia, and this term in fact appears since 1373, and instead Wallachia Minor, so Lesser Wallachia for Oltenia, first recorded in 1377. Sometimes, from an Hungarian perspective, of course, the land would be still called Terra Transalpina, so land beyond the mountains, or Partes Transalpine, which is interesting because it stresses that it was not a single land, but some from those parts there beyond the Carpathians. And by some degree, they weren't even that wrong about that, because again, the Vlachs inhabited a wide amount of territories, right, that were not all politically united. So that's why we distinguish Moldavia from Wallachia, from Transylvania, etc. And it's important that the aforementioned the terminology is used properly by the official documents issued by the Royal Chancery of Hungary during the entire 14th century still. And such terminology was not used necessarily in a Hungarian demeaning sense towards Wallachia, because actually the same Wallachian voivodes would use Terra Transalpina, etc., in their own Latin drafted documents. This other aspect is fascinating. The political institutional ideology of the Wallachians, however, drew the most from the one of Constantinople, right? It was the most advantageous because it was fundamentally the one of an absolute monarchy, where the princes could rule over the same church. They wouldn't have to essentially respond of anyone but God in this way, right? So the papal connection would have entailed instead another type of relation. Not that the Wallachians didn't play a bit with this, but it was easier, right? More unitary, and for a power like their own, more compactly laying in the Balkans, that again were pretty troubled areas, just to seek this mostly local solidity and along the traditional Orthodox pattern. Of course, they used the terminology "by the grace of God" from the 14th century as divinely ordained princes, who, as sovereigns, were also military leaders. This is typical, again, of the warlike Balkan reality. Also, supreme judges. So there is a lot of that traditional. You see there also in the Kinnett's title, right? The idea that after all these kinglets that eventually emerge into greater power are fundamentally, in fact, free, right? They are, that this was a problem for the centralization of the country as well, but it's if it had been still a migration era reality of some sort. And you can see this even in the heraldry of these powers, with the crow, with the werewolves. Like, we've made a video about Balkan heraldry, and you realize how dark, after all, their view was. And it's beautiful, right? It would eventually encompass the entire kind of Byzantine and broader Balkan idea of martyrdom, especially during the Ottoman invasions, and so on. So, as princes of Wallachia, the Basarab dynasty that basically established itself as ruling the country, patronized the church, like investing in monasteries, as we were noticing before, was very remunerative, because there was an ecclesiastical immunity, and it was just also a show of magnificence and munificence in front of the subjects. their decisions became law de facto. They could, of course, enforce it, which was complicated, another story, but mostly the methods of still can politically compact around the voivodes, given the international situation. And as such, the voivodes also retained the old ancestral idea that they were factually the proprietors of the lands, of all the lands in the country, where in fact they were actually devoid of extensive personal land holdings. However, the dynastization was important because practically the Wallachian boyars would elect always a successor within the Basarab dynasty, aside from of course, some rebellions that could happen at a time. But we will see Wallachian history in another video, right, as far as the following times are concerned, because it's fascinating. The same boyars emerged from a mix of those kind of leaders, retinues, commanders, village and communities, elected representatives, right? It's also possible that there was some foreign influence in all this. As after all, we have seen it. There were lots of different elements around, right? Westerners, even steppes elements. So by the Wallachian scale of power, also having foreign marriages or things like that was an important way of calling in individuals that would remain eventually tied to the dynasty, not kind of trying to sneak away just as autonomous aristocrats, right? And so at different times, the Bulgarians, the Serbians would fall under the Ottoman Empire during the second half of the 14th century. And there was a general foreign influence on these areas. For example, Mircea the Elder, ruling between 1386 and 1418 as voivode, in fact, of Wallachia, accepted at some point even Polish suzerainty. As we've seen, also the Moldavians had done that, because the Jagiellonians were pretty involved in harassing the eastern frontier of Hungary from the north, and even Wallachia, that is actually in the south, could participate in that, connected to Moldavia at some point. The same Hungary, of course, received the Wallachian submission in 1395, Poland in 1387, right? And we know that Wallachia was paying a tribute to the same Ottomans from 1417. So opening a history again of long vassalage. When the Wallachian voivodes accepted Hungarian suzerainty, so the old bond of receiving, for example, the district of Fagarash in Transylvania from the Hungarian kingdom remained. For example, in 1366, the King Louis I of Hungary, ruling between 1342 and 1382, granted the area to Vladislav I of Wallachia, that ruled between 1364 and 77, with the title of Duke, right? And Prince Mircea the Elder received the same from King Sigismund, ruling between 1387 and 1437. During this time, as we've seen, there was kind of an upstream, Danubianly speaking, center of Wallachia that eventually tries to subdue the eastern part towards the Danube mouth and the Black Sea. And in fact, it's during Mircea the Elder that Dobruja, so fundamentally the Danube delta, became part of the polity, or at least there was a satisfactory control of it, or recognition of it, etc. It was always complicated. Of course, the Brugia was somehow also relatively more depressed, but it had ports, right? So it's obvious that reaching them was quite an interesting option. We've seen even in the history of Moldavia that when the Ottomans were pressuring, in fact, that country as much as Wallachia, the Genoese that still had important colonies in the Black Sea, as you know, were quite interested. Actually, the Venetians even more at some point, because still they were present as well, in actually supporting these powers against the Ottomans and opening connections with them and getting interested. I mean, the Italians were infiltrating pretty much everywhere, and they were working quite relentless for supporting politically, militarily, diplomatically, whatever, any of these powers if they could, not necessarily stop the Ottomans, that they also facilitated at some point, because it was unpredictable even up to very late in time that in fact the Ottomans would become a threat of that scale. But anything that would of course benefit them, and even against one another. So that's, for example, a very, I don't think there is so much, but I'm sure that if, especially in Italy, anyone would like to research about Wallachia and Moldavia in those very years in the 15th century, I'm sure it's plenty of sources in Venice, in Genoa, but in the former espresso that could tell us something more that we cannot find, in fact, in Wallachia and Moldavia, because sources from there were less or survived with greater difficulty. So that's, in my opinion, a very interesting and viable historiographical research direction, right? So I use here the broader picture of a country gradually molding, right, and finding its place, exploiting fundamentally the surrounding instability, joining raids, exploiting the terrain, and also in later times wanting to remember a connection with the Transylvanian Vlachs of some sort that may, again, with Radu Negru very possibly have been the case, but still being less likely, right? And they will think more connected to, Vlachs south of the Carpathians, and that were probably already within, just like the Transylvanians, by the way, so you don't make any favor there to the Arpads, under the Hungarian monarchy, and later to the Angevins. And thus, still telling us, this is the beauty of legends, is that they always tell you something that after all is plausible. It's something that has been accepted by a political identity that has come to be Wallachia. It is not even, as we'll see later on, also just a minor player, right? It did have an important leverage on the surrounding countries. They struggled to strive to maintain an autonomy as long as they could, as just this video exemplified, and that matured essentially as a polity on its own until late in time, in the contemporary era, and that still makes one of the historical regions of Europe, right? So I find this very interesting and worth of consideration. And then I know that you're all awaiting for the history of Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, that was Wallachian, aside from what Bram Stoker, that didn't understand. Actually, he wrote very well, but didn't understand much about history, telling you the truth. And we will probably talk about him, in fact, in a video, of course, about late medieval Wallachia, because it was black, and he's just within another situation there of advanced Ottoman presence, but that's in fact part of what the mythology around the figure originated from, not only, by the way. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.